I didn't know it yet, but the HOA was about to make the biggest mistake of their existence, and it all started on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was sipping coffee on my dock, watching the sunrise ripple across the water, when 3 HOA board members marched toward me like they owned the place. Their clipboards, stiff posture, and stone-cold expressions told me something was coming, something big, something bad. And trust me, none of us could have imagined the war they were about to start. The woman leading them, Mrs. Granger, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, didn't even say hello. She jabbed her finger at the planks beneath my feet and declared, "This dock belongs to the HOA now. All of them do." Just like that. No hesitation. No explanation. As if she had the power of a judge, sheriff, and landowner rolled into one angry package. I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what I'd heard. My dock? The one I'd maintained for years? The one I'd repaired after storms? The one that literally came with my property deed? But before I could even respond, she shoved a folded notice into my hand, smirking like she'd already won. "This is your official warning," she said. "Remove all personal items and surrender lake access by Friday." I almost laughed. Surrender lake access? To my own lakefront? But the tone in her voice told me this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a takeover. And they were dead serious. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I had something none of them expected. Something stronger than intimidation, stronger than their fake authority: hidden documents tucked away in a fireproof box in my attic. Documents that would flip their entire claim upside down. But at that moment, all I saw was an HOA hungry for power. They were convinced the lake was theirs, that every dock automatically fell under their control, that I was just another homeowner they could push around. They thought they had the upper hand. They had no idea they were standing on property I legally owned. They had no idea what was coming. Little did they know, this would be the beginning of a battle they could never win. In the hours that followed, I walked the shoreline, replaying every word they had thrown at me. Anger simmered, but something else burned hotter: determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I wasn't just defending a dock, I was defending years of investment, memories, and the freedom to enjoy my own land without someone barking orders. And deep down, I sensed their arrogance would become their downfall. The moment the HOA stormed off my property, I knew exactly where I needed to go. Not to a lawyer. Not to the police. Not even to the HOA meeting they'd scheduled for later that week. No, I went straight to my attic. Because buried in a dusty, fireproof metal box was the one thing that could obliterate their entire claim before it even started. As I climbed the ladder, the old wooden rungs creaked beneath my feet. The attic smelled like cedar and insulation, untouched for years. Amid the cobwebs and childhood memorabilia was the box I remembered from the day I closed on the property. The realtor had called it a little historical bonus. I had laughed at the phrase back then. Now it felt like fate. I knelt down, brushed off the dust, and popped the latches. Inside were old photographs of the lake, yellowing survey maps from decades ago, and most importantly a thick stack of legal documents stamped with bright red county seals. My hands shook as I pulled them out, reading line after line, page after page. Every sentence hit me like a shockwave. Not only did my property line extend several feet into the water, meaning the lakefront was indisputably mine, but the original landowner had subdivided the shoreline in a way the HOA clearly didn't understand. The docks weren't communal. They weren't shared property. They weren't even included in the HOA's jurisdiction. They were individually deeded. Privately owned. Protected by county-recorded easements. And mine? Mine was the anchor of them all. The primary dock. The original dock. The first one ever built, grandfathered in with rights stronger than anything the HOA could throw at me. I sat back against an old trunk, letting the realization settle in. They had barged onto my property, threatened me, and tried to take something that was never theirs. And they had done it with absolute confidence, armed with nothing but assumptions and bravado. But assumptions weren't law. Documents were. The more I read, the angrier I became. Not loud anger, quiet anger. The kind that simmers and sharpens your focus. The kind that prepares you for battle. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, I was going to show them what real power looked like, the kind printed on official, notarized paper. I made copies of everything: maps, deeds, boundary lines, historical notes. I highlighted every section that proved my ownership. By the time I finished organizing the evidence, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready. If Mrs. Granger planned on confronting me again, she was in for the shock of her life. Because the next time she tried to claim the lake, I would be standing there with the truth in hand, and it would hit her harder than any warning notice ever could. By the time Friday rolled around, their so-called deadline, the HOA had transformed my quiet lakeside neighborhood into a battlefield. Flyers had been stuffed into every mailbox. Group chats exploded with messages. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. According to the HOA, I was illegally occupying community property, refusing to comply, and endangering the integrity of the neighborhood. All lies, of course. But lies told loudly enough can start sounding like truth. I knew they were planning something. I could feel the tension in the air. But nothing prepared me for the scene waiting outside when I stepped onto my porch that morning. 7 board members. 3 volunteers with clipboards. A man carrying caution tape. And, of course, in the center of it all, Mrs. Granger, arms folded, lips pursed, radiating authority she never actually had. Behind them, half a dozen curious neighbors stood watching like spectators at a circus. She marched toward me with the kind of confidence only someone completely wrong can have. "Today is the final day," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are in violation of HOA Code 14B. Remove your items from our dock immediately." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a big laugh. Just a quiet, incredulous one. Because now that I knew the truth, her performance looked ridiculous. "Your dock?" I asked. "You sure about that?" She narrowed her eyes. "Don't play games. The HOA has full rights to this lake." That was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. I held up the envelope I'd prepared, heavy with documents, highlighted sections, and legal references. Her smug expression wavered, just for a second. She didn't know what was coming, but she sensed it wasn't good. "This," I said calmly, "proves otherwise." Before she could respond, I handed the envelope to her. She snatched it from my hand and flipped through the pages, her eyes darting left to right, confusion spreading like cracks in glass. The deeper she read, the more her confidence drained. Her face paled. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked like someone had unplugged her. The crowd behind her leaned forward. "What is it?" one neighbor whispered. Mrs. Granger didn't answer. She kept scanning the documents, flipping faster and faster, like she believed there had to be a page that saved her. But there wasn't. Every line told the same story: the HOA had no authority over my dock. None. Zero. And then came the moment I'll never forget. She turned to the board members, eyes wide, voice trembling ever so slightly. "This can't be right." But it was. And she knew it. The war they had declared? It was about to backfire spectacularly. The silence that fell over the crowd was almost cinematic. Mrs. Granger stood frozen, documents trembling in her hands, her confidence evaporating like mist over the lake. Behind her, the board members shifted uneasily. They had marched onto my property with the swagger of conquerors, and now they looked like a group of tourists who realized they were holding the wrong map. Finally, one of the board members, a tall thin man named Victor, cleared his throat. "What, exactly are we looking at?" I answered before she could regain her voice. You're looking at county recorded deeds, original survey maps, easement rights, property line extensions. Everything proving that not only is my dock privately owned, but the HOA has zero jurisdiction over any shoreline on this side of the lake. A few neighbors gasped. Someone muttered, "Zero jurisdiction? Seriously?" Mrs. Granger tried to recompose herself. She straightened her shoulders, forced a smile, and attempted the same intimidation tone she'd used all week. These documents must be outdated. Or incomplete. The HOA's charter clearly states. Your charter, I interrupted, doesn't overrule county law. And these documents aren't outdated. They were reconfirmed just 5 years ago by the previous owner. But here's the part you really won't like. I took back the stack and held up a single sheet, the one with the bold red seal. This is the grandfathered deed to the original dock. The one every other property owner's rights stem from. Meaning, if anything, the HOA should have been asking me for permission before setting foot on it. The crowd erupted. Some laughed. Some whispered. A few board members exchanged panicked glances. And for the first time since the confrontation began, I saw something new in Mrs. Granger's eyes. Fear. Not of me. Not of a dock. But of being exposed. Victor reached out and took the papers from my hand, scanning them with increasing alarm. This overrides everything we based our decision on. It sure does, I said. Because you based your decision on assumptions. Not law. A volunteer stepped forward, holding a roll of caution tape they clearly no longer knew what to do with. So, we're not seizing the dock. No, I said, you're not seizing anything. Mrs. Granger's composure finally cracked. Her voice rose, sharp and desperate. This doesn't mean you can disrespect HOA authority. We still have rules. And I follow them, I replied. The ones that actually apply to me. The board members pulled her aside for a frantic whisper session. But it didn't matter anymore. They knew the truth. Everyone did. The lake wasn't theirs. The docks weren't theirs. Their entire power play had collapsed in the span of 5 minutes. And the best part? The HOA board huddled like a collapsing football team, whispering furiously while the neighbors lingered, eager for drama. I watched them scramble, their formation tightening, their voices growing more frantic with every passing second. It was painfully obvious they'd never expected to be challenged, especially not with actual law. They thought intimidation was enough. But intimidation crumbles fast when truth walks in. Finally, the group broke apart. Victor stepped forward first, looking like someone had just informed him his car warranty had expired. His voice lacked the fake authority he'd wielded earlier. "We'll need time to review these documents thoroughly." I nodded. "Take all the time you want. The county already reviewed them. Twice." Behind him, one of the volunteers quietly stuffed the caution tape back into his bag, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. Then Mrs. Granger stormed forward, fury smoldering beneath her forced composure. "This doesn't change the fact that you've consistently been difficult. You refuse to participate in community cleanup days. You don't attend meetings. You don't even respond to HOA emails." "Because," I replied calmly, "they usually don't apply to me." She opened her mouth, ready to argue, but Victor cut her off. "Barbara, stop. The documents are clear. We can't touch the docs. If we push this, he could file a legal complaint against the HOA. And win," I added. "Easily." A few neighbors chuckled. One of them, a guy named Ron who'd always been quietly on my side, called out, "Maybe instead of harassing people, you guys should fix the broken streetlight on Maple Road." Laughter rippled through the group. The board members stiffened, clearly realizing their authority was slipping not just legally, but socially. That's when the meltdown started. Mrs. Granger spun around, snapping at her own board. I told you we should have checked the county records before confronting him. Why didn't anyone listen to me? Victor threw his hands up. You insisted we act immediately. You said he was taking advantage of the HOA's kindness. Well, maybe if someone else actually did their job. Their argument escalated fast, each one trying to dodge the blame falling like boulders from the sky. The neighbors didn't move. Nobody tried to interrupt. Everybody watched as the once mighty HOA board fractured right there in my yard. It was chaos. Beautiful, bitter chaos. Finally, Victor turned back to me and dragged a hand down his face. Look, we'll need to call an emergency session. We'll contact you when we have an official statement. You do that, I said. I'll be on my dock. My legally owned dock. And as they retreated bickering, defeated, humiliated, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of their trouble. It was the start of mine, and their unraveling. The HOA's emergency session didn't take long to materialize. By Monday evening, I received an email written in the most passive-aggressive tone imaginable. It read like a blend of corporate legalese and a toddler's tantrum. They claimed they were reviewing all available information, seeking clarity, and working toward a mutually beneficial resolution. In HOA language, that meant, we're panicking, but we don't want anyone to know. But the real surprise wasn't the email. It was the meeting. They hosted it in the community center, a beige building that always smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and cinnamon air freshener. I walked in with a folder under my arm, the same folder containing every piece of proof they hoped didn't exist. The room was already packed. Neighbors filled every chair, leaned against walls, even stood near the back door. Nothing draws a crowd like an HOA scandal. At the front, the board sat behind a long folding table, lined up like nervous students about to take a test they hadn't studied for. Mrs. Granger was dead center, posture stiff, lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Victor sat beside her, flipping through notes with trembling hands. When they saw me, a ripple went through the room. Some people nodded. A few smiled. One guy gave me a discreet thumbs up. The board, however, did not look thrilled. Victor cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. It squeaked so loudly half the room winced. We are here today to discuss the matter of the lake access dispute. Dispute, someone muttered behind me. He literally showed you the deeds. Victor ignored it. After careful review, we have determined that the documents provided by, he glanced at me, the homeowner do appear legitimate. The room erupted with whispers. Mrs. Granger shot him a death glare. Appear legitimate, she hissed into her mic, which unfortunately broadcasted her irritation to the entire room. Are legitimate, Victor corrected, swallowing hard. In fact, the county confirmed this afternoon that the dock in question is privately owned and exempt from HOA authority. That sentence hung in the air like a firework frozen mid-burst. So what now? A neighbor asked. Do we owe him an apology? Mrs. Granger bristled. No one said anything about an apology. Another neighbor chimed in. Oh, come on. You all accused him of theft. You tried to seize his property. It wasn't a seizure, she snapped. It was a what? I asked calmly. A misunderstanding? A power grab? A violation of my rights? The board looked cornered. Because they were. But the real twist came when one neighbor stood and asked the question that would turn the tables completely. If the HOA overstepped this badly, what else are they doing that's illegal? The question hung in the air like a lightning bolt. What else are they doing that's illegal? You could practically feel the oxygen leave the room. Every board member froze. Mrs. Granger's eyes darted side to side, as if searching for an escape hatch. Victor rubbed his temples. The rest of the board stared at their papers like they hoped the words would magically shield them. But the neighbors. They came alive. A woman in the front row lifted her hand. Last month you fined me for having flowers taller than 24 inches. I checked the charter, there's no such rule. Another neighbor jumped in. You threatened to tow my truck because you said it wasn't allowed in my own driveway. Turns out that rule only applies to commercial vehicles. Someone else shouted from the back, you guys raised HOA fees twice this year without a community vote. Isn't that against bylaws? The board flinched as each complaint hit like a punch. Mrs. Granger slammed her palm on the table. This meeting is about the dock, not unrelated concerns. But the momentum had shifted entirely. A tall man stood. It's all related, Barbara. If you were wrong about the lake, maybe you've been wrong about everything else. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Victor leaned into his mic, voice cracking. Let's stay focused on. No, the man interrupted. We're done staying quiet. That was the moment the room exploded, neighbors firing off grievances, questions, demands, accusations. Years of pent-up frustration erupted like a volcano. Every rule the HOA had overstepped, every unfair fine, every power trip, it all poured out. And I just sat there, silent, watching the structure that had tried to intimidate me crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. Finally, a soft-spoken older woman, Mrs. Delaney, stood up. The room quieted almost instantly. She'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, respected by all. She spoke gently, but her words cut deep. This community trusted you. And you used that trust to control us, not help us. Today we learned you didn't even understand your own boundaries literally. If you overreached this far with him, how can we believe anything you've done is valid? The board sat stunned. Mrs. Granger's eye twitched, fury and embarrassment warring across her face. Then Mrs. Delaney turned to me. Thank you for bringing the truth forward. If you hadn't fought back, we would have never known. I nodded. It wasn't about winning. It was about stopping them before they went too far. But little did any of us know. Stopping them was only the beginning. Because what happened next would shake the HOA to its core. After the meeting erupted into chaos, the board abruptly adjourned, practically fleeing the room. But the damage was done. The neighbors had seen their leaders exposed, cornered, and utterly unprepared. Word spread through the community like wildfire. By the next morning, over a dozen people had posted about the incident on the neighborhood forum. Screenshots of bylaws, fee increases, and questionable rule enforcement were being shared openly, things the HOA had always insisted were confidential. It didn't take long before someone suggested the unthinkable. We need an audit. Not a financial audit, though some people hinted that might be necessary too. No, this was something deeper. A full review of every HOA decision from the past 3 years. At first, I didn't think they'd actually go through with it. Most HOAs rely on members being too busy or too tired to challenge them. But this time, the board had pushed too far. The attempted takeover of my dock had lit a fire in the community, and nobody planned to put it out. By Thursday, a petition began circulating. It needed 40 signatures to trigger an internal investigation. It reached 62 by evening. The board couldn't ignore it. They were officially required to respond. And oh, they did. Desperately. An email went out, another long, rambling message filled with excuses and jargon. They blamed miscommunication, unintentional oversights, and organizational strain. They insisted the attempted lake seizure was based on misinformation, though they never explained where that misinformation came from. Neighbors weren't buying it. Ron stopped by my driveway that afternoon. You realize you kicked the first domino, right? He said, grinning. I just didn't want to lose my dock, I said. Yeah, well, you may have accidentally started a revolution. I chuckled, but there was truth in his words. I had merely defended myself. It was the HOA's reaction, the arrogance, the lies, the bullying that set everything ablaze. 2 days later, the audit committee formed. 3 longtime residents, 1 former accountant, and Mrs. Delaney herself. They demanded access to records the HOA had never shared before: meeting minutes, fine logs, correspondence, fee justifications. The board resisted. Of course they did. They stalled. Delayed. Claimed files were missing or in transition. But the committee kept pressing. Then came the moment none of us expected. A committee member found an external drive in the HOA office labeled Archive, Private. Inside were documents, emails, and logs that the board had hoped no one would ever see. The kind of evidence that didn't just show incompetence. It hinted at something much worse. And suddenly, my doc wasn't the biggest problem the HOA had anymore. When the audit committee uncovered the external drive labeled Archive, Private, nobody expected anything more than old meeting notes or forgotten spreadsheets. But within an hour of opening it, Mrs. Delaney called an emergency gathering not of the HOA board, but of the entire committee and a handful of trusted residents. I was one of them. We met in her living room, a cozy space that normally smelled like lavender tea. That night, it smelled like tension. The lights were dim, blinds drawn, as if we were about to plan a covert operation. Mrs. Delaney sat at the head of the table, the flash drive plugged into her laptop. Several files were already open on the screen, each more unbelievable than the last. "This," she said, tapping a folder titled Infractions Review, "is what they've been hiding." Inside were logs of every fine issued in the last 3 years, except they weren't random or rule-based. They were targeted. Repeated patterns emerged. Certain residents were fined constantly, often for violations that didn't exist. Others, friends of the board, were completely exempt, even when they broke actual rules. Another folder revealed something even worse. Email exchanges between board members discussing how to pressure certain homeowners into moving. One message, written by Victor himself, suggested issuing consistent low-level enforcement to make a family more compliant or more likely to sell. The room went silent as we read it. Then came the financial documents. Not full evidence of embezzlement, but close. Unjustified expenditures. Missing receipts. Payments to companies no one had ever heard of. Strange consulting fees that always went to the same P.O. box. Ron blew out a long whistle. They've been running this HOA like a personal piggy bank. And weaponizing the rules, Mrs. Delaney added. That dock situation? It wasn't about the lake. It was about control. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It all made sense: the aggression, the confidence, the way they escalated without hesitation. They weren't just wrong. They were used to getting away with anything. But now they were exposed. "What's our next step?" I asked. Mrs. Delaney closed her laptop. "We can't confront them ourselves. Not yet. We document everything. We organize." And then she paused, her expression firm. "We call for a full community-wide vote to remove the entire board. A recall. Something no HOA ever expects to face." The weight of it settled over the room. This wasn't about my doc anymore. This was about restoring an entire community that had been manipulated, bullied, and controlled. And for the first time in years,